All right, guys, bang, bang. I've got Jack here with me. Thanks for taking the time to do this.
Yeah, thank you.
For sure. So, for those that don't know you, you have lived many different lives based on your background. Maybe kind of just give us an overview where you grew up, and then how do you get into the military and some of the work you did there.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in suburban New York, a town that started off. It's called North Tarrytown, and we changed our names in the 1990s to Sleepy Hollow. I graduated from North Salem High School and joined the Army at 19, and went into infantry basic training, and then the Ranger indoctrination program, and served in 3rd Ranger Battalion in the Army and deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq. And from there, I went over to Special Forces, and I served in 5th Special Forces Group, deployed back to Iraq. And then I got out of the Army in 2010, went to college, majored in political science at Columbia, graduated in 2014, and have basically worked in journalism and media ever since then, really heavily covering national security, particularly the special operations community, the intelligence community, clandestine covert operations. Those are kind of the things that I normally cover.
Got it. And so when you're in the Ranger Battalion and you're getting deployed, maybe talk a little bit just about the work you guys are doing there, and then how that differed from once you'd gone through all the Special Forces training and you went back. Like what was the difference in terms of the types of missions and the work you guys were doing?
Sure. Yeah. So the differences between Special Forces and the Ranger Regiment are pretty stark. The two units have different missions. Rangers will typically work in platoon-sized elements, maybe even up to company or battalion-sized elements, depending on the scope of the mission. Special Forces operates in 12-man teams called ODAs, Operational Detachment Alpha. And their Special Forces operates in a more decentralized environment. There's no one really telling you how to do your job. There just isn't time for it. And you're all NCOs on a Special Forces team. You're all sergeants. So you're really expected to know your job and to just do it without literally there's nobody and there's no time to hold your hand and micromanage what you're doing, particularly on deployment. So when I was with Ranger Battalion, we were part of the Joint Special Operations Task Force in Iraq. We were actioning targets, hitting multiple targets during every 24-hour period. They're considered time-sensitive targets, so we were just going out again and again and again. The churn was very quickly. In Special Forces, I was working as a senior advisor to a Iraqi SWAT team, about 100 people. So I was almost kind of like the company commander, really, for them. And I trained them with some of my other teammates on the ODA. We trained them every day. And then when operations came to us, we would be, the senior tactical advisors taking them out on missions.
Got it. And so as you're doing this, how much kind of understanding do you have both about what's going on a much larger scale, right? So I was in the military through the National Guard, deployed to Iraq. And for us, where there was no kind of special operations training nor mission set, we basically knew, hey, here's our mission today, but didn't have great insight into like how we fit into a much larger battle plan that kind of leadership would have foresight into. We were much more just, here's your mission, go execute that mission, come back. For you guys, did you have more insight into kind of the broader plan and kind of the genius behind the madness, if you will, or was it very much kind of, here's your target, here's your mission, go execute, come back?
I think we had a very cursory understanding of what the larger strategic picture was, similar to what you mentioned. I think that there was a notion, when I was in Ranger Battalion doing those types of missions, that we were trying to degrade, defeat, and destroy what we called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So we're trying to put them on their heels, put them on their ass, and kind of short circuit the insurgency. In Special Forces, it was 2009 by the time I was there with SF. So the mission was more about getting the Iraqi military to stand up on their own 2 feet, to build, to some extent, building capacity in the Iraqi government so that the American forces can withdraw. A policy decision had already been made that we were going to pull out of the country. So that was about as much as I could tell you on the, big strategic level. For the most part, it is, hey, this is your little part of the world. This is your mission, and you go and execute it as best you can.
For sure. And then what was the impetus for you to go from the Ranger Battalion to want to go on the Special Forces side? I know some guys get kind of recruited and pulled up. Some say, raise their hand and say, hey, I'd like to volunteer to go do this. Where did you fall on that? And understanding that you'd already been deployed before to then want to go through the Special Forces training. A lot of people outside the military would be like, that's crazy. But kind of talk through a little bit of the logic there.
Well, I think there were a couple things that played into it for me personally. Growing up in Ranger Battalion is great. I think it is absolutely the best place in the Army for a young soldier to go. But it's also not necessarily the place that you'd want to spend your entire career. It's very regimented. It's very disciplined, for good reason. But as you look at it, you think, do I really want to spend the next, 8 years, the next 12 years, however much longer I'm in the Army, do I want to spend it yelling at privates because they're wearing the wrong color socks? Like, is that my thing? And also, the mission, it's kind of more of the same. I mean, I think I was only in Ranger Battalion for 3 years. And I think we seized Lawson Airfield on Fort Benning 12 times. I mean, at a certain point, you're like, okay, I'm ready for something new. And Special Forces offered that. And I also had met a lot of SF guys at other places during my Army career, like when I went to Ranger School. Shooting in the all-Army competition, things like that. I crossed paths with Special Forces NCOs and got to pick their brains a little bit about their job and what they do. So it was, I'm happy with it and what I did. I mean, I thought it was a good choice for me.
Yeah. And then talk a little bit about the Special Forces training. I always tell people if they want to understand it really in depthly to go read the book, Masters in Chaos. Seems to be one of the better written books on the topic. But just kind of what was your experience like going through that while the United States is at war, in two different countries?
Yeah, it is interesting. And that all of your NCOs, all of your instructors are combat veterans. They're all coming out of theater and now they're trying to get you ready. Get the next generation of guys ready to go into it. It was interesting. I went through Special Forces assessment and selection in winter of 2005. It was a ball buster. I won't lie to you. I came right off my deployment in Iraq with Ranger Battalion, came back and did a training cycle with Ranger Battalion, and then went right into Special Forces selection, literally the next day. I was on a plane, got there. So by that time I finished SFAS, I was mentally and physically exhausted. I won't BS you about that. I was just done by the end of it. But I got selected, and then you start the Special Forces qualification course. That includes, small unit tactics training. You go to the survival, escape, resistance, and evasion course. You get your language training. In my case, it was Arabic. You go to your MOS, your military occupational job training for Special Forces. In my case, I was a weapons sergeant. So that was a pretty cool course. And then the cumulative exercise at the end of it is called Robin Sage, and it puts you into a simulated unconventional warfare scenario. And it takes place in literally in communities in North Carolina, where you integrate with the local population and you meet them and work with them. And, it ranges from, you could end up taking literal Boy Scouts out on training missions, training combat missions in Robin Sage with Boy Scouts to, I was in people's houses drinking red wine with them, trying to rub shoulders. These guys are like partisan forces. I went to church with somebody else and we did a little handshake where he handed off the secret note to me with the intel on it, in the middle of a church service. It's a really fun exercise, very useful exercise also in introducing, Green Beret students to what their job is supposed to be.
Yeah. And then as you deployed with this fifth group, did you know that, hey, I'm going to spend another 1 or 2 years doing this, and then eventually I'm going to go ahead and transition out and go to school and have some master plan? Or did you basically just take each year kind of one by one?
No, I did kind of take each year one by one as it came. I did have some idea in my mind I would have, liked to have stayed in for a career. And I'm the type of person, I'm just about job satisfaction. I didn't care about careerism. I don't care if I don't need to be the sergeant major of the Army. I don't care. If I got to be the senior 18 Bravo on an ODA for 12 years and then, finish the last couple of years as the Intel NCO on the team, that would have been fine for me. But I mean, I just saw just the mind-crushing, soul-crushing bureaucracy of the Army and what was going on in that unit. And it just gets to the point where it's like, man, why am I here? Like, why am I doing this? If all of the initiative has already been taken out of your hands, if all of the decisions have been made, that you don't have any ability to plan things or to make things better in the unit, because, you know, your higher headquarters, this is in garrison, that your higher headquarters is, you know, engaging in that hand holding and that micromanaging. It's like, what am I doing here? You know, like someone told me at one point, in the unit, he was like, you know, if you treat a boy like a man, he has to man up. But if you treat a man like a boy, he's going to default to that. So that was kind of my experience there, and what led to me, you know, ultimately leaving the Army in 2010.
Yeah, that's a great quote. That couldn't be more true in terms of how you treat people. It's basically how they end up acting. When you were on deployment with special forces teams, any like memorable moments outside of kind of the combat and the things that people really focus on? I think a lot of people don't understand kind of the camaraderie and the like non-mission type environment, and how that's just very different than what they probably expect.
You know, it's funny you asked that, because just yesterday my daughter was asking me something about like medical issues, or like, she's asking, if I go to the doctor, do I have to get a shot? And I was like, oh, let me tell you about when we learned, our medic taught us how to give shots in the Army on our special forces team. And like one by one, we'd each take turns putting on the rubber gloves, and your buddy would drop trowel, and you'd grab a big handful of his ass in one fist, and then take the shot, the vaccination needle. And our medic's like, yeah, you just throw it like a dart, like you're playing darts. You throw it into a dartboard, so right into an ass cheek, give them the shot and pull it out and put it in the sharps container. So you know, that's probably not something that people do on their normal everyday job, grabbing their buddy's ass and sticking a needle in it. But, you know, hey, it's the Army.
The reason why I'm laughing is because a lot of these things are they're life-saving measures, right? You know, all the different training organizations and kind of courses they put you through. But when you're in the military, there's definitely a different view of it, and it's almost like you got to joke around doing it because it's so ridiculous.
Oh yeah.
But you do understand that long term, like, hey, it's probably good that they're training us on all this stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. And the medics, we have the best trained medics in the world, without question. And they're very good about kind of spreading that knowledge around and teaching you as much as they possibly can, because, you know, on the battlefield, there aren't enough medics to go around. There never are. So each soldier has to be a first responder, has to be, you know, have combat lifesaver skills. So they really, you know, do a lot of cross training with you.
For sure. And so when you decided to go ahead and leave the military, what was the plan? Did you know, hey, I'm going to go to school, or kind of how did you end up at Columbia?
Oh, geez. I mean, yeah, I did not have a real solid plan. I did plan on going to college. I started looking at colleges. Was actually looking at trying to use my GI Bill to go to school in London. That was kind of my plan. But the problem with that, as great as the post 9/11 GI Bill is, one limitation it has is that if you go to school overseas, the BAH they pay you, the housing allowance, is based on a U.S. national housing average. So you'd be getting paid like $500 living in London. Like, that's just not going to work. So went to school in the United States. I started off, did my first year in Mercy in Dobbs Ferry, and then I transferred to Columbia in Manhattan. And, you know, initially I was a business major, international business major. Then when I transferred, I think I was a history major, and then tossed that aside. And I ended up going to political science.
For sure. And so as you've kind of gone from, you know, a teenager to a Ranger, Special Forces, to then having a college degree from Columbia, through all of that, like, what was kind of the North Star for you, right? I'm always interested in this idea of most people I talk to, they actually don't have one, right? It's kind of, they're figuring it out as they go. And then eventually they like find something and they go all in on it. You've spent the last, call it 6 years or so, around media and journalism and kind of all of this international relations, political science, special forces stuff. And it seems like you kind of found that thing now. But did you have that before you graduated? Did you have interest in media, or is that just something that kind of naturally you progressed into?
it's something that I naturally progressed into. It wasn't a plan or anything like that. It was just a series of things that sort of happened, and then finding what I enjoyed doing. And if you think about it, I've kind of kept a foot in the same thing all along. I mean, I wanted to be in the Army since I was a little kid. I joined the Army and I did that. And then since leaving, I've covered the military, and I've been to Syria a couple times as a journalist. I've been to Iraq a couple times as a journalist. I've been to South Korea. I've been to the Philippines working in that capacity. And I cover these issues, journalistically all the time. So I've kind of always kept a hand in it. And I mean, if there's any North Star, I think it's just my own curiosity and wanting to know how things work, to find the secrets. What are the secrets that our government is keeping behind the curtain, and trying to uncover those and discover those things. And beyond that, reporting what's true and what's accurate, and cutting through that, because I think there's just this very fascinating place where there is what is true, and there's what you're allowed to say, and those things can be two different things at the same time. And when that situation occurs, I think it's very interesting, and I think that's a that's a fun place to work as a journalist.
For sure. And so when you go back to, I'll call them combat zones, not all of them are actually designated that way, but places like Syria, Iraq, and just kind of have higher levels of danger. How is it different as a journalist versus when you're carrying a gun, special forces or a ranger? Like there's different mission set that you're there to do, or job to do, but you also have different equipment, like one's a camera, one's a gun.
Yeah.
How did you kind of think through that or level set that mentally?
Well, it's a hell of a lot more dangerous for starters. Like I was saying before, that we have the best trained medics in the world when you're in special forces or rangers. Well, when you're a journalist, you don't have a medic standing by, to help you if you get shot. You don't have airstrikes on call if you need them. You're not armed. You just do not. You don't have the logistics. And it's very invigorating, almost intoxicating in some ways, that you get to find your own missions and find your own stories, and you negotiate safe passage through closed international borders. And you're doing these things that the Army would never, ever have let me do. I was able to go places and talk to people and do things that the Army would freak out over. So you have this freedom and this self-initiative, that's this like self-reliance on yourself, that you have to make all these things happen, because nobody's going to do it for you as a freelancer, as an independent journalist. Nobody's looking over your shoulder. No one's telling you to go left, go right. It's all on you. But it's also exhausting and difficult, and it is quite dangerous. So, I mean, as far as my approach, I'd say, two of the people who I guess inspired me from a journalistic perspective is Robert Young Pelton and Jim Morris. The latter being a journalist for Soldier of Fortune magazine, who served as a Green Beret in Vietnam. And Robert Young Pelton was a journalist. He is a journalist who, he was all about kind of just like embedding with local rebel forces and just going into places like Chechnya, going into places like Somalia, kind of fearlessly, but without, he was never asking anyone for a hall pass. Was the impression I got, and I really admired that. And I think he wrote a book called "Come Back Alive" that I read it when I was a very young soldier. That kind of, I think, trickled off and rubbed off on me in a lot of ways.
Got it. And so any situations where, as you're there as a journalist, some of the special forces training and things like that end up becoming an asset to you? Obviously, just naturally, I'm sure, staying out of danger, not going places that you shouldn't go, some of that type of stuff that's more intangible. But any kind of exact situations that you remember being like, wow, I'm really glad that now that I'm here as a journalist, I have that special forces training?
100%. I mean, all the time. I lean on that background to inform my reporting. And when I was I was in a battle with the Peshmerga one time, and I mean, I just had a much better understanding of the battlefield and what was going on there than I think maybe other people would have had. When I meet soldiers anywhere, I'm able to speak the same language that they are. and maybe build a little bit of a rapport that they might not have with somebody who is, say, a journalism major or something like that. So it's, yes, I lean on that experience tremendously. I think, yeah, it helps keep me alive, and it helps, inform how I write stories, quite frankly.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I'd reached out to you and I wanted to do this conversation was I saw that you were one of the first, if not the first, to recently talk about the domestic deployment of the 82nd Airborne, right? And it just kind of caught me off guard of, wait a second, here's a guy who comes from the Special Forces and Ranger world, so he has an understanding of how the military works that most don't have. Two, he's got early access or first access to a story that is a pretty big deal for a whole bunch of reasons we get into. And then three was like the mainstream media either hadn't picked it up yet, didn't understand the gravity of the situation or whatever. And so to me, it just like really highlighted like this is kind of the future of a lot of reporting, right? Is more of the independents being able to leverage their personal experiences, their personal networks, and access to information to surface, as you said earlier, like the truth, right? And that's so powerful today. So maybe let's start with just like talk us through kind of that story and kind of how you came across it and why you thought it was important enough to kind of bring it to light on Twitter and elsewhere.
Yeah, sure. They absolutely, with all the recent civil unrests going on in the United States, and we had a protest movement, a peaceful protest movement, and unfortunately, some rioters and some other violent aspects, trying to hijack that movement. And, a heavy police presence getting deployed, the National Guard being deployed. And these are all things that are sort of to be expected, right? And for a governor to deploy the National Guard is perfectly lawful and legal and normal. There's nothing irregular about that. But then when I had a source reach out to me and say that the 82nd Airborne Division's IRF, their immediate response force, had been told to pack their bags and get ready to leave. This was back on Saturday, so 2 Saturdays ago now, that they had been, at least on a self-initiative, they'd been alerted and told to be ready to go. They received the actual alert a few days later. On Monday, they were out doing EIB lanes, the Expert Infantry Badge. So they're on Fort Bragg on their base doing normal infantry training, and they get the word that they are being deployed. This is it. They have a CONUS domestic deployment, and MP cars pulled up, blocked off the roads so that they could get right to their station, right to their brigade, draw out all of their gear, throw it on pallets, pack it all, do whatever they had to do, and then get down to Pope Air Force Base. And they were prepped there. And in the early morning hours, it would have been early Tuesday, they flew on helicopters, UH-60 helicopters, Blackhawks, and C-17 transport aircraft, and flew to Joint Base Andrews in the National Capital Region. So as I first learned about this when the initial alert happened on Saturday, I reported it. Then when they actually deployed that early Tuesday morning, I reported on that. And it was kind of shocking that, yeah, the rest of the press did not pick up on this story until way later. And I could speculate on why that is. But at the end of the day, you had what is now a very irregular deployment happening. You have active duty paratroopers being deployed ostensibly, for riot control measures on U.S. soil. Now, the 82nd Airborne has been deployed in this sort of capacity in the past, back in like the 1970s. Maybe there was one in the 1980s. But it's sending paratroopers after, protesters or rioters in American cities. It's not something that happens every day. In order to do it, President Trump probably would have had to evoke the 1807 Insurrection Act, which is essentially a loophole to posse comitatus that says in times where there is rebellion and insurrection, where people are having their constitutional rights violated, but the states cannot or will not protect those people's rights, then the federal government can deploy active duty soldiers to try to mitigate that. So in a lot of ways, we walked right up to the brink last week. We walked right up to that line, up to that precipice. The United States military has amazing support from the American public, and like poll after poll, like America loves the military. They love the troops, but the day that we have active duty soldiers in the streets, God forbid, killing people because an altercation erupts between protesters or rioters. And you just imagine the Wikipedia page on that one in 2030 saying, you know, General Milley presided over the 82nd Airborne Division's deployment to Washington, D.C. during the 2020 riots, where they opened fire on peaceful civil rights demonstrators. Like, it would have said something like that. And I mean, thank God that didn't happen. But we came really close to it this last week.
Yeah, and I think part of my understanding of this, right, is there's kind of multiple stages of importance. So one is just like you described, the deployment of active duty military. A lot of people don't realize the National Guard is not active duty military. It's very much run by the state governors. And so it has kind of a different kind of objective and a different organizational structure. Yes, they have a uniform that looks pretty similar. Yes, they've got guns, like all that kind of stuff, but it is different. To your point, just being deployed is a big step. But two is that deployment has a connotation that comes with it of much more kind of serious clampdown, right, from the federal government. And I think you and I probably both see a situation where like soldiers are Americans first, and they are very much there to kind of protect and serve and want to do the right things, but they also are trained very differently than the police. Right. And so kind of to your point, maybe kind of elaborate on that a little bit of just like, you have probably some of the best training in the world coming from that. It's very different than a 6 week to 6 month kind of police training program. Like, how do you think about that difference?
Yeah, I would point out also, I don't have any critique of the 82nd Airborne Division. I mean, these are good soldiers, and the Immediate Response Force, the IRF, is, it's advertised as America's 911 call, right? The president could call them up and immediately deploy them. They did on New Year's Eve, as tensions were mounting with Iran. They deployed to Iraq. So, I mean, these guys did their job, and they are effective, and the IRF is effective, and it can function in times of emergency. When America needs paratroopers, on target, these guys can do it. The problem in this case is that the 82nd Airborne isn't trained or equipped for riot control. It's not their job. They're paratroopers, they're airborne infantrymen. I mean, think about the guys who jumped into Normandy, right? That's their bread and butter. That's what they do. These guys maneuver and close with and destroy the enemy. As maybe some NCOs might say, they kill people and break things. That's their job. This is the Army. This is what they do. So deploying those same soldiers for a domestic disturbance to do some sort of riot control is very concerning, because you just have soldiers who are wired up. They're looking to fight. This is what they do. And, once one of them gets hit with a brick, you don't really know how quickly that's going to escalate. And what are the force control measures? What are the escalation measures? What's the ROE going to look like? And I can tell you, and I haven't talked about this or written about this anywhere else, but when they deployed the IRF, it was Immediate Response Battalion 1 of the Immediate Response Force. So IRB 1 deployed, Joint Base Andrews, they get there, then they get moved to a gymnasium at Fort Belvoir, and they're sitting on cots, and you had 82nd Airborne paratroopers sitting around discussing with one another the legalities of what they're being asked to do. And they're having conversations about the U.S. Constitution and whether or not this is right or wrong. And I don't fault them for that at all, but I don't think they ever should have been put in that situation in the first place.
Yeah. This is the meat of the conversation, right? In my opinion, which is, let's first talk about ROE, or rules of engagement. One of the things I think I even tweeted it at one point was saying, look, some of the actions that we're seeing from the police would have been illegal or heavily frowned upon when I was in Iraq, right? Yes. The rules of engagement, and one of the situations that I always caveat and say, look, there's incredible complexity. And in today's environment, being a police officer is almost an impossible task, right? Because literally everyone's filming you all the time. Everyone's agitating. Like, there's just so many issues that go on. But I think it was in Louisville, the cops were shot at. So you can imagine you're a police officer, somebody shoots at you. And the way that I've heard the story and kind of what I've read is they basically turned and they shot back It just happened to be with a group of protesters there. Somebody gets shot and killed. Now, was that the guy who shot them? Was it somebody else? There's a bunch of kind of unknowns. And so it's less about that specific instance as much as if you or I were in Iraq or Afghanistan and we turned and
Shoot
shot.
back.
Yeah, well, if we turned and shot into a group of unarmed people and ended up killing somebody, there's a lot of questions going on. And, in today's day and age, there's actually probably a lot of pressure because there's just a different rules of engagement there, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole host of different incidents we could go over and bring up where, we've seen on video police, shooting people in the back as they're trying to run away. And it's like, oh my God, if I did that in Iraq, I'd be court-martialed. You're not allowed to do that. This is crazy. And I'm not a law enforcement expert, but I think we have created quite a quagmire in this country. We have these longstanding issues regarding police brutality, but it's not just about policing. It's about the entire legal structure and how it functions in the court system. Things that, should have been fixed a long time ago. And, these institutions, whether it's the police or the military, I think there's a tendency to try to hold everything together with duct tape and, 550 cord rather than, bring forth real policy measures, real legislation, and really, fix the problem.
Yeah, and so it leads then to this question of there's a structure legally that exists, right? You and I, as much as we would want to change or improve or whatever, it's just that's the environment that we're currently in. That's the legal structure that exists. And so when soldiers get told to deploy domestically, like the 82nd Airborne did, you described a situation where they're literally sitting there talking about the constitutional rights and kind of what's legal, what's not legal. A lot of people would just say, hey, look, maybe we don't want our soldiers focused on that. And they should just always, be put in situations where they know what they're being asked to do is legal, but, good on them, I guess, for kind of critically thinking about it. How do you think about lawful orders, unlawful orders, and where, if at all, we ever see soldiers who basically say, look, I'm not going to do that, right? I'm actually going to put my gun down because I don't agree with the orders that we're receiving. Like any kind of insight around that?
Well, I'm quite thankful that I was never asked to do anything unlawful or illegal during my time in uniform. However, I think when it comes to this issue, I mean, the conversation comes out of the Nuremberg trials, of course, and is it okay to say, hey, I was just following orders? And the conclusion was that no, that's not. That's not a lawful protection. You can't put civilians in a ditch and machine gun them and say I was just following orders. That's not okay. So I think it's really important for our soldiers to be informed and educated about the laws of land warfare, the Geneva Convention, and UCMJ, and we submit ourselves to these institutions, the military in this case. But it's not okay to, just plug into the matrix and disconnect and give yourself, give yourself permission to do whatever, your peers are doing. Maybe it's not even in order. It's just like, hey, everyone else is doing it, I'm going to do it also. It's not okay to defer like that and just turn off your brain. We are thinking human beings. And when soldiers are asked to do something unlawful and illegal, it's their duty to refuse. And I'm thankful that those 82nd soldiers were thinking about these things. Again, I wish that they had never been placed in that position to begin with. And that's a political matter. But I think that, yeah, it's absolutely important that our troops think about these subjects.
Yeah, I mean, I literally remember having conversations with guys in Iraq about like what is the most likely scenario in which soldiers would be aware enough and feel strongly enough to kind of step down, right? And it was always things on domestic soil. Like it's so much more clear cut when it's on U.S. soil versus in the middle of a war zone, somebody shooting at you. Like obviously there's a lot of chaos there, but the domestic soil stuff is much more clear cut, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, and most soldiers want nothing to do with any sort of like domestic deployment. It's just not their thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so I guess the other question then here is we've seen in other countries and this is something in the United States that previously has been kind of intellectually, we haven't even had to think about this because we're so far from it, but we have seen in other countries things where you get separation from the military and the political structure, right? Where either the politicians want to do something that looks closer to dictatorships and the military disagrees and wants to restore order, sometimes even vice versa, right? Where actually the military wants to kind of take legal control and the politicians want to stay with some sort of more democratic process. Like, how does that play out in today's society? And is that something that you think kind of soldiers are even aware of, the historical precedents that's been set in other countries and some of the importance there?
I mean, I don't know how aware the average soldier is of some of those things. You know, like I was having a conversation with with a former French Foreign Legionnaire about the Algeria campaign and how they were going to launch a coup in Paris because they weren't happy with what was going on. That was back in what, the late 50s. But anyway, I mean, I think this last week we did see some of those things coming to the forefront in some very interesting ways. You saw General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, wrote a memo reminding soldiers about their obligation to the U.S. Constitution, which was very peculiar, to say the least. And then you had that phone call where the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, was telling the governors that they need to get in there and dominate the battle space. And it was so upsetting to so many people to hear the Secretary of Defense talk about American cities like that. And I agree with the criticisms, but I think at the same time, we have to look at that comment in context now, based on what we know. President Trump was threatening to deploy active duty soldiers into American cities. And Mark Esper was trying to convince the states to call up more National Guard and quell those riots so that the active duty military was not called up. So, I mean, a very poor choice of words that he was using, but I think, I don't know for a fact, I think I know what he was trying to do there, that he was trying to prevent the actual military from being deployed. So, I do think you're seeing some very interesting things happening with both the civilian leadership and both active and retired generals. In some ways, you could argue, trying to sabotage the White House's policy.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was having a conversation with a friend recently, and we started going through it. And it was after General Mattis's letter, right? And we started to look through. If you go all the way back to, I think it was a Navy commander who, around the coronavirus stuff, basically kind of broke command, it seems like, and ended up being reprimanded for it, and ultimately stripped of control of the ship. If you look at the situation with kind of, was it tear gas, was it not tear gas, to go take a photo in front of the church? If you look at the letter from the Joint Chiefs or General Mattis, you start to get into this weird world where the military operates in a very structured, kind of top-down, leadership-driven environment. I think the general population knows that, but doesn't understand it as well if you've never served in the military. And for those that understand the importance of some of these things, these were pretty big inflection points, in my opinion, of people stepping out of what is normal behavior in order to either voice an opinion. I mean, literally to write a memo is a pretty big deal, based on who it came from, what it said, who it was written to. Those things just seem abnormal compared to what we've seen over the last 20 years, even while we're a country that's engaged in multiple wars.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. And I would argue that what you're seeing is the individual leaders trying to rush in and fill a leadership void and perhaps even a morality void that exists. And as you point out, soldiers follow orders. They exist in this rigid hierarchy, this chain of command. And you tell them, this is why America loves the military. Look, you tell the Marines, go take that hill, go take that city. They do it. Not a lot of BS. They just go and do it. Unlike many other branches of our government that can't get anything done, you send in the 82nd Airborne or the Marines, they'll get it done. But when you have a confused state, when you're getting conflicting orders, and what we saw this last week with the 82nd is a perfect example. It's a case study that'll make a great thesis paper, or someone's PhD dissertation. Who's in charge? What's going on? Where are orders coming from? How are they being received? And when soldiers are in that kind of confused state, they're going to start freelancing, and they're going to start figuring out what the mission is for themselves, because they have to. I'll give you another interesting example of what happened in the last week. When these guys got down to Fort Belvoir, they drew ammunition for their weapons, both lethal and non-lethal. They were supposed to go out with non-lethals had they been called out. An informal decision was made that each soldier would carry a magazine of 5.56 in their back pocket with 10 rounds, 10 live rounds in the magazine in their back pocket. Why? Because you're receiving obtuse orders that don't make any sense. And as a squad leader or a platoon sergeant, you will never leave your soldiers out there hanging without any means to defend themselves. You'll never do that because it's morally and ethically wrong, right? Because that's your job as a leader, is to take care of those boys. Now, I do not agree with these sorts of deployments. I don't think that it should have happened in the first place. But when you have soldiers in a very confused environment and it's not clear what's expected of them, they're going to start coming up with their own mission.
Yeah, and this is actually one of the things that kind of blends into, I think, a lot of the police critiques as well, which is we have to remember that the United States has been engaged in war in Iraq and Afghanistan for almost 20 years now, right? And we have trained a lot of people to be soldiers to go fight a war. This is, the training that you receive has some overlap when we're at peacetime or at wartime. But when we're at wartime, as you described, kind of the special forces training, these were people who had just come from combat who are here to train you to make sure you survive and thrive in the environment that they just came from. And so what ends up happening is, in my opinion, you almost get soldiers who they're used to going out on missions, right? Or they're being prepped for missions in a combat zone. The idea of going anywhere without live rounds is so foreign to them, right? That they say, hey, well, what is the 1% chance that something really, really negative could happen here on the streets of America? We better be prepared, right? And that's where you get something like, okay, let's bring some live rounds in our magazine. Same thing happens on the police forces, I think, where we started to see this militarization of the police. And a buddy of mine who's a cop said, look, I went to Iraq. I'm on the police force now. He goes, I have an MRAP. He's like, literally, our police force has a mine-resistant vehicle that, like, we can stand out of a gun turret. There's no gun up there, but literally there is a gun turret that I can stand out of. He goes, you tell me how many people can kind of switch context like that, even though they're still carrying a gun, and now it's a protect and serve mission versus more of a kind of an offensive, combat-oriented mission.
Yeah, and it gets even more convoluted than that, because we train soldiers for war, but then we've deployed them to counterinsurgency missions in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, where their role is like somewhere between being a soldier and a police officer. But you're absolutely right that, we trained these guys, their experiences they've had in the Middle East dealing with insurgents and terrorists, and then they're suddenly having to flip the switch and act in a completely different frame of mind, in a completely different context, when their entire frame of reference is war. And now you're asking them to become riot control cops. It's just another reason why that's such a dangerous situation to be in. And some people have not, I actually took some criticism from South Korean leftists for saying this, but there's the Gwangju uprising in the 1980s in South Korea. It was a horrible what happened there. But the point I was trying to make was that the South Korean government deployed the military and South Korean special forces to deal with the student protesters. And one of my sources told me that the special forces soldiers were told that these people are North Korean communist infiltrators. You cannot tell special forces soldiers something like that and then send them in to put down student protesters. It's just a disaster.
And look, without kind of getting into the political ideology and all the nuance, because frankly, no one's going to be able to solve that problem, is that kind of like there are some parallels or commonalities is what we just saw, right? If you went to 10 people on the street and said, was it Antifa, not Antifa? Was it peaceful protesters? Was it rioters and looters, right? Like all of this terminology that gets kind of thrown around in the political sphere doesn't really matter because it's just words at that point. When it gets actually implemented on the ground, though, the difference between, hey, we're going to preside over and protect the community during a peaceful protest versus there is Antifa, which is supposedly now a domestic terrorist organization. And you get into this whole world. You're like, wait a second, like those are two very different situations. And it's all based on how you verbally describe what the environment you're going into, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you can go into it and have it feeling like, hey, these are Americans. We need to treat them with dignity and respect. But then your squad leader gets hit in the face with a brick and like it's game on. You know, there's an incident, again, mostly forgotten to history. In 1994, there were these prisons down in Panama where there were Cuban exiles that had a big uprising there. And the U.S. military played a role in putting them down. There was a platoon of American military police, and somebody decided that the gravel in these camps, the gravel would be like fist-sized rocks. And these guys were MPs armed with like batons and riot shields, and they were like modern day Spartans, like forming a phalanx. And they got hammered. So then that night, the MPs went in with some guys from 2nd Ranger Battalion and delivered an unholy ass whooping on those prisoners with like axe handles and baseball bats. And again, I mean, it's just another example of why you don't use these types of soldiers for this type of mission. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Well, what's your thoughts on what the average citizen can do? That's probably the number one question that I've got from people as they kind of see all of this unfold. There's the health crisis, the economic crisis, then you get the social unrest, and they're sitting there and they're trying to balance kind of two worldviews. One is like, the world is, collapsing and everything is horrible and it's only going to get worse. The other is, hey, we live in the safest, most prosperous time in human history. And like, yeah, things may be a little uncertain here or there, but like generally we're trending in the right direction. How do you kind of balance those two scenarios? And then like, if you're the average citizen who doesn't have the military training and things like that, like what's your kind of advice to them, I guess?
Yeah, this is an age of uncertainty and irrationality, and that paradox absolutely exists. And I think solving it is kind of like the conundrum of like the modern Western world. Like, where do we fit in? Where do we exist? What is our identity? And I don't know that I can solve that for anyone. What I would just offer is this: is that pick one or two things that you can speak to from your experience. From your knowledge. If you're a nurse, you can speak to healthcare. If you're a firefighter or a police officer, you can speak to being a first responder, or you can pick a few things and really study them in depth and then push for meaningful change in those one or two things. I think that because of social media and, the 24-hour news cycle, our attention is pulled in a million different directions. In my case, I know the military and I know this sort of stuff, and I have the contacts. So I write works of journalism that hopefully enlightens people or illuminates them to certain things that are happening. And I would encourage others to look at it that way. Think about what you know and then what you can do, and focus on, one or two things rather than spreading yourself too thin. In this time we're in right now, I think this is a great time to push for programmatic policy reforms. One of the big problems we have in modern day America is we have protest movements. Could be Occupy Wall Street. It could be the current movement, if you want to call it BLM or you want to call it something else. But there's a lot of anger and frustration in regards to police brutality, and it has to coalesce around policy reforms. Otherwise, it just becomes this sort of outpouring of emotion that doesn't go anywhere. So that would be, if I got to, play king for a day, that would be my suggestion to people.
Yeah, it's one of these things, and I forget who I saw it online. It might actually even been you. Somebody just said, look, asking for justice sounds great. It's really hard to measure success against that, right?
Right, because justice means something different to everybody. They're called glittering generalities: peace, justice, truth. Everybody wants those. Everybody. But you ask them, hey, how do you feel about those guys over there? Or how do you feel about those, BLM protesters? And the amount of venom that comes out of their mouth, is not really so associated with the peace and love that they were saying 2 seconds ago.
Yeah, but it feels like the protesters, I saw a proposal recently, and I actually forget what they called it, but it was like there's 8 key points around, I'll just call it police reform. right? And it was everything from kind of demilitarizing to some stuff with the unions or whatever. But it was the first time I had seen like, okay, here's 8 bullet points, like literally
That's good. Yeah.
fits in a bullet point, format. And maybe you can't get them to kind of negotiate all 8 of them, right? You can't get the police to agree to certain things, whatever. But like, at least you got a starting point now.
Right. And if you can get half of it, it's good.
Exactly. Here's our demand list, right? And if you kind of go through the game theory, like your demand list better be pretty aggressive because you're not going to get 100% of it, right?
Right.
So like put some things on there you're willing to give up. But I just thought it was really interesting from that perspective. The last thing I want to talk to you about is kind of the current state of media, right? So you've had some of the most extreme experiences as a journalist, right? You've literally gone into combat zones, kind of done all of these different things. But you don't work at the New York Times. You don't work at, the Washington Post. Talk to me a little bit just how you think of your job and how it's evolved over time and the tools and kind of where you think media in general is going outside of those large organizations.
Well, I've had somewhat of a irregular experience, to say the least. I kind of, for better or worse, I mean, I pole vaulted over some of the things that other journalists have to do. I started off my career in that world working for a small company that I helped found and start up. And now I work for another company, a larger company, but I'm just one cog in the wheel, of course, covering veterans issues. I've covered some very niche issues, and I've had the luxury of kind of picking my own assignments and to a large extent executing them the way that I wanted to. So I've been very fortunate, very lucky in so many ways. I do have critiques and criticisms of the media. And I mean, first off, we have to define what we mean by media. This is media, reruns of Friends is media. But we're probably talking more about the press, right? Specifically the press. And the biggest problem I think it has right now, I mean, is that everyone's kind of chasing web traffic. And this was something that Andrew Yang brought up actually pretty prominently. It was pretty funny to see during his campaign is that, everyone's chasing clicks and it's all about clicks. And, and people also complain about the media, but this is the flip side. And I would flip that around on them a little bit. I mean, yeah, a lot of the media is not good and it's actively detrimental, but why do you click on it? Like, why do you watch it? Why are you consuming that media? Like, if it's true that you just want facts, why don't you just read AP and Reuters and stick to the facts? But you don't. The data shows something different. The data shows that people go after that content that is emotionally engaging and gets them angry and gets people riled up. So there's a certain amount of individual responsibility. On the other hand, is that as consumers of media, readers of the news, consumers of news media, we have an obligation to ourselves and our family and our friends to, sort the garbage out and focus on, good reporting. So I tell people that and they get mad at me when I say that because it kind of interrupts, the idea that, America would be like a Norman Rockwell painting if not for the media. But there are problems, the press has problems. They, what I was referencing before that, they're chasing click-through traffic is one of the bigger problems. The 24-hour news cycle is one of the bigger problems. The constant churn of content that, everyone has to get it out there and you have to get it first. And you have to be writing every day. And when you write every day, you're really not an expert on anything because you're just spread too thin. So there's a lot of problems. I don't know how we come out of it. I mean, honestly, I don't know if the boomers out there, they're already lost. Like they have not been able to adapt to this media environment at all. My generation is struggling. I think maybe it's going to be a younger generation that's kind of going to inoculate themselves to it. Like I think they're going to grow up with a more natural filter of like, yeah, that's nonsense. And just like, they're going to be the ones who are not going to click on it because they're going to grow up with a different frame of reference and kind of sorting out the garbage. But that's also something we could probably teach media literacy in our schools and, how to verify, like, is this story true? Is it false? Should I pay attention to this? Should I not pay attention to this? I can't tell you how many times a day I have people, trying to get me like, hey, why don't you cover this story? Why don't you cover that story? And it's like, hey, this is like a no-name alternative news website. There's no byline on it. There's no, and this is the most important thing you learn in college. Check the source citations. Where are they? If they're not there, why is that? Just as very basic media literacy, those are things we should teach to teenagers in high schools around the country, and that would do wonders for us, just nationally.
Yeah, the one that gets me is because I agree with you that like the media literacy is much easier to implement when it comes to if you see like a website article, right? For all the things that you just announced. But the one that blows my mind, and I don't know what the solution is, right? So it kind of sucks that like you understand the problem but don't have any proposal for a solution, is the social media content, right? And the thing that I saw recently that just absolutely caught me off guard was I'm sure you saw this picture of the White House with the lights turned off. Mm-hmm. Right. And there was a bunch of people sharing this photo and they're saying, hey, when the protesters showed up for demands, the president was turned off the lights and went in the bunker. Right. Or, whatever it was. And like it fit perfectly into the narrative. Right. And so I saw that probably for 3 days and thought that was an actual picture. And then after 3 days of seeing it, I saw somebody posted an article and was like, hey, that picture's fake. Right. Not fake in terms of it's a manipulated photo. It's just from a different period of time.
Yeah.
And I was sitting there like, wow, for somebody who like, I actually think about this stuff pretty regularly, whatever, I didn't even think twice about like whatever, because literally there was a media article that said, hey, the lights went out, he went in the bunker, whatever. And you just naturally make the.
Remember the pictures of the Mexican immigrants in the detention facility that were spread around social media, and it turned out it was from the Obama administration?
Another great example, right? And so like you kind of get into this world of even the people who think about it all day still get tricked,
mess
right?
It up, yeah.
And it's just, we're human. And so you almost got to understand, hey, we're not going to solve it 100%, but how do we move it forward in a major leap so that we can actually start to get people good information so they can make good decisions and really stamp out some of the divisiveness. But again, to your point, the reason why the media creates a lot of that content is because it works. Right. It's doing exactly what they want.
And the media, I mean, the press also provides a certain amount of fact checking. There is some self-correction. So like 3 days later, the other side of the story comes out and you saw in the mainstream media, like, no, actually that's false. Okay. Like you said, people are human. They make mistakes. I've made mistakes. It happens. But it can be incredibly dangerous. I mean, imagine a mistake that, could incite a riot, that could incite an attack, that could incite an act of war. It's incredibly dangerous and incredibly scary to think about. And like you, I don't necessarily know what the answer is. Maybe that's one of those things that like AI will solve for us as time goes on, because the fact checking will happen so quickly that it'll be exposed. But yeah, I mean, as long as there are human beings involved in, writing and producing news, there are going to be mistakes in it, from time to time.
My favorite example that I saw of kind of the way that a situation can be written at from two different perspectives is there was I want to say Slate, but don't hold me to the exact publication, but I think it was Slate. They wrote an article saying police erupt in violence over the weekend was the title of the article. And basically they were saying, look, everyone's writing, saying the looters and the protesters and the violence and kind of that was a narrative. And they basically flipped around and said, well, hold on a second here. Like, here's a bunch of videos of the police, like swinging a baton at an unarmed guy. Right. And the point was kind of made just by using that headline. And what you start to get into is like, look, we need critical thinking and individual responsibility because ultimately, like, you're responsible for the information you consume and also how you then process that information.
Right. And that's the crux of the problem, is that there's more information available to every single human being on the planet than ever before in history. But we have not yet developed on an individual personal level the ability to process and analyze all of that information. And even as, I was sitting here talking about, hey, I know the military, blah, 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 I'm an expert. But this last week, there's more information coming at me than I could possibly process. And it was overwhelming. And I wasn't able to accomplish everything I had hoped to accomplish. So if in my little niche, my little corner of the world, I'm overwhelmed, then you can imagine how bad that must be for other people out there who know nothing about these subjects, And I might know something about the military, But, we start talking about finance. I asked you earlier, if you ask me about quantitative easing, I'm lost. I have no idea what I'm talking about. So, when it comes to the, finance, I'm as lost as anyone else in this country.
Yeah, well, and as I responded to you, even the finance people couldn't describe it right now because it's so chaotic. Listen, Jack, I could sit and talk to you literally forever. I finish up each episode with same two questions. First being, what is the most important book that you've ever read?
Wow. I was thinking about that also. A book that really had an impact on me as a person. And even in the military, if you were to ask me both in the military, in journalism, in my entire life, the one that really affected me the most is The Divided Self by R.D. Laing, who is a Scottish psychologist. And he was very, very interesting in the sense that he was a real criticism of psychiatry, not necessarily that he was anti-psychiatry, but he criticized it. And this is back in the 60s and 70s where they're electroshocking mental patients all the time. I mean, it was really draconian stuff. He believed in breaking down the barriers between the doctor and the patient. And he even did this experiment for several years where he lived in like a group home with schizophrenics. And he lived there with them and lived with them, and they ate together and they did everything together. And he'd say, the patients help me and I help them. And he was against this idea that that anyone who experiences the world differently can be categorized as insane. He didn't believe that. And he believed that a society as messed up as ours has no business whatsoever in calling someone else insane. That we're a world, we're a society, we wage wars, we murder people, we wage these horrible, horrendous atrocities, and then we're going to point our finger at somebody else and say, hey, that person's insane because they experience the world differently than I do. So R.D. Laing, kind of his work, I think, influenced me in how I relate to other people in my job and in my life, and that I just don't believe in these artificial separations and these silos that, and I'm not saying I'm always good at this, but as far as breaking down some of those barriers that exist between people and different stratas of our society, that I think it's important to go and experience what they experience. There's a really famous story about R.D. Laing, and it appears in the movie they recently made about him, where there's a mental institution, there's this teenage girl, and she hadn't talked in years. She just sat there in the cell, in this padded cell, rocking back and forth. So, Ronnie Lang goes and he visits and he sees this. He goes into the cell and he sits down next to her and he starts rocking back and forth next to her. And after about 2 hours, she starts talking to him. And that was him. He's an eccentric but brilliant, singular person, singular human being, one of those people that the world wasn't and isn't quite ready yet for.
I mean, that's an incredible perspective of the world, right? It reminds me actually of Kanye West says, show me a genius who's not crazy. And it's kind of this play on words of like, you're crazy if you're not successful, but if you're successful, oh yeah, then you're the genius, right? And it sounds like this guy really, really understood some of those nuances.
Yeah, the Leonardo da Vinci's, the Nikola Teslas of the world. The world just isn't ready for them.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. All right, so from a hard-hitting question to a much more fun one, aliens, believer or non-believer?
I think they're probably out there somewhere. I think ET is out there. I don't think that we have any contact with them. I don't think that, all the hoopla about UFOs, I don't think they're from outer space or anything like that. But yeah, I think they're out there somewhere on some world for us to discover one day.
What is the logic behind believing that they're out there? I agree with you, but what's kind of, how do you get to that?
Well, I think there's just so many worlds, so many galaxies, so many planets that by chance there is going to be one that is, close enough to a sun, but not so far away that life can begin developing there. And, it seems like we're finding some evidence of that. The real conundrum there is because of the great time spans involved, will civilization evolve on two separate planets in the universe simultaneously that they're able to discover each other, rather than like one going extinct So these civilizations exist at different times. We might explore space and find entire planets that are irradiated because they wiped themselves out with nuclear wars or something. So that's another interesting question.
I couldn't agree more. The spectrum of time is the most underrated aspect of this whole thing, and as humans, it's easy to forget, like, hey, the world's been around for like, billions of years,
Yeah.
right? Or
Yeah.
like, all right, our lives seem not so important in the grand scheme of things all of a sudden.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe ET burned himself out. They burned out their civilization 1 billion years ago. I mean, or maybe we will 1 billion years before some other planet evolves. Who knows?
I forget who came on, and their question to me was not do aliens exist or not, but do we want to discover them or do we want them to discover us? I said,
Right.
we probably want to do the discovering. Awesome, Jack. Well, listen, I appreciate taking the time to do this. You're doing some excellent work, and obviously your perspective is one that's very rare and unique, which I think is important in today's times. So please keep up the good work. Where can we send people? Do you want to send them to go check out the book? Do you want to send them to somewhere else? Where would be the best place for people to go check you out?
Oh, geez. Well, yeah, if people are more interested in my own experiences and anecdotes, I wrote a memoir called Murphy's Law that you can find on Amazon or bookstores anywhere. Covers my time in the military and my time as a journalist as well. And I also run a weekly live stream and podcast, and we interview members of the special operations community, also people from the CIA. We do it live. We take viewer questions, talk all about their own experiences. So, it's not just about me. If you really want to find out more about me, you can go check out the book. But, we really enjoy, me and my co-host, Dave Park, really enjoy bringing on these veterans and these, retired members of the intelligence community and hearing about their experiences, all the way back to the Vietnam War.
You just had, I think I saw somebody who came out of special operations and then became a CIA, kind of field officer, right?
Yeah. My friend Jeff Butler, he was a Navy SEAL officer, and then he became a CIA ops officer and was deployed to Afghanistan. So, yeah, he's a really interesting guy.
It's a pretty crazy life to live, but it's full of some good times and good stories. So people should definitely go check it out. We'll link to it in the description.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it, Anthony.
All right, sounds good, Jack. We'll do this again soon.
Yeah, sounds great.